Godson, chair of the event today, this vital panel seminar on Prevent, Review, Where Next, and we've got a star-studded panel with from the Prevent space and people who've played a key part in this debate over the last 2 decades. Prevent, as so many of you know, in the words of one of our wags here at Policy Exchange, Prevent is the best known and most controversial programme that most people have never heard of. But it says much about our national values and in particular the intensive debate. One of the many interesting things is it's not so much been between parties as was shown by the discussion when the latest Prevent Review, authored by William Shawcross, was launched in the Commons the other day and was commended to the House by the present Home Secretary. The debate has been as much within parties and between parties and between elected politicians, and in some instances with permanent servants of the state. So this has been a subject of great interest to us here at Policy Exchange, and the key panelists today will take us through all aspects of it. Particular pleasure, we'll go through them all in alphabetical order, since I couldn't think of any other better way to do it or to justify it intellectually. But always a delight to have Lord Carlile of Berriew, KC, on our platform, known to many of you, of course, as independent reviewer of terrorism legislation for many years, and most recently in this context as briefly as Prevent Reviewer in 2019 to 2020. But Alex, always want to hear what you've got to say, and look forward to you discoursing and answering questions along with our other panelists afterwards. Thank you. 5 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, I thought the most controversial thing in Policy Exchange was who takes Poppy for a walk, actually. But I'll now start my 5 minutes. I was in a city in the north when I was the independent reviewer of Prevent. And in the room were 2 Muslim men who lived locally, were leaders of their local community, who had come to talk to me about the nature and reputation of Prevent. And I said to them, Prevent's toxic, isn't it? And they looked at me with surprise. And I said, well, why are you looking surprised? And one of them, who spoke for them both, said, well, actually, what we say to our community is, in running a Prevent project, what I am trying to do is exactly what it says on the tin: prevent people from becoming terrorists and violent radicals. So I said, but what about the protests you get from people that this is intrusive, that it's a form of espionage and all the rest of it? And he said, well, we don't have those problems at all. This is mythology that is put out by outsiders, and actually within our own communities, of course with some exceptions, the vast majority accept the benefit of what we're doing and will support us. That is not to say that there shouldn't be some changes, but we want Prevent to continue. And I found that very compelling, particularly as it was corroborated by others as I went around my temporary tenure on the Prevent Review. I welcome the issues that have been identified by William Shawcross. I agree very broadly with his report. It is not much different in content, though possibly a bit different in style, from what I would have written had I been able to complete my task. I would just focus on a number of issues which I hope, in their correct acceptance of William's report, the government will take into account. First, the limited transparency of Prevent policy and practice, and the inadequacy of independent oversight and continual, and I think I mean continuous, review of Prevent implementation. Secondly, the limitations of an annual funding cycle for projects, which reduces achievement of the long-term objectives of Prevent. When projects are funded, funding them from year to year, as many people told me, just isn't adequate. Third, there is scope for clarifying the relationship between Prevent and other strategies, particularly other countering extremism and safeguarding approaches, to increase the join-up in some local delivery areas and to tackle duplication in other areas. Fourth, I would identify that there is scope for clarifying the appropriate role for the police, both counter-terrorism police and non-counter-terrorism police, in prevent delivery. And there may be regional variations. There are significant variations, for example, between the way Police Scotland deal with prevent and the way most England and Wales police forces deal with prevent, caused by demography and geography. Fifth, I would identify as an issue questions as to how effective the prevent duty is in practice, not in theory. I'm very much in favour of it in theory, but how it is delivered in practice, including the abilities of local practitioners to make referrals, how well they are equipped to fulfil their role, and any unintended consequences of the duty. Sixth, I would question the role of fundamental British values in prevent. I was a Welsh MP for 14 years, and I can tell you that British values are British values, but they're different in Llanfair, Pwll Gwyngyll, Gogerwch, Lindrobwll, Llantysilio, Gogogok, and Burnley. And, you know, so the oversimplification of British values is, in my problem, and needs to be addressed further. And finally, I would identify as a particular issue questions regarding the implementation of prevent in prisons. Obviously, there have been serious problems, such as the Usman Khan case, and also in probation, which in my view is not structured in a way at the moment that leads to a prevent strategy being clearly identifiable throughout the prison service. So those are the main issues I would identify, all of which I think are completely consistent with William Shawcross's report. I'm happy to develop on them later if anyone has any questions.
Brilliant. Thank you. Sir John.
Thanks, Dean. I too welcome the review. It's been a long time coming and a long time getting published as well. And I was very happy to see it published in the form that it was, without significant redaction, because I think that is important. Because one of the things that Islamists in particular do is seek to close down debate by actually trying to restrict the sort of things that you can say in public about Islamism. And I want to talk about Islamism, and I want to talk about ideology, because that's really where I came from in all of this. I was a former diplomat, and I was asked in 2014 by David Cameron to lead the Muslim Brotherhood Review. And my bit of the Muslim Brotherhood Review was actually about the external-facing issues of Islamism, so Islamism in the Middle East and North Africa in particular, but in the Muslim world more widely. And there is an interesting distinction between Islamism in Islamic, in Muslim-majority countries, or indeed countries which identify as Islamic countries, and the West, and which is itself instructive of the ways in which ideology is used to promote a particular view of the legitimacy of the state, the legitimacy of the political community, and so forth, all of which is a challenge to our conceptions of liberalism. And Lord Carlile's point about British values is something I talked to Cameron about at the time, in 2014. And I said, you talk about British values, what are they? I mean, if it's just about old maids cycling to Holy Communion in the mist, then it doesn't mean anything. You really have to specify what they are. And for me, ultimately, the heart of this issue of what it is that's being contested, it is the nature of law, and the distinction between secular law and law based on revelation, which is at the heart, actually, of the Islamist project. If you look at what's happened in the middle, there is also, of course, and there has been for some time, this debate about whether you call Islamists Islamists. I mean, I'm very happy that William Shawcross calls Islamists Islamists and actually defends the use of this, because this has become an area of some contestation, which seems to me absolutely ridiculous. Because if you look at what Islamists call themselves in Arabic, for example, and what scholars and other commentators in the Arab Middle East call Islamists. They call them Islamiyun, they call them At-Tayyar al-Islami, At-Taraf al-Dini. All these words are to do with Islam, which is not to say, of course, as William himself says in the report, that Islam and Islamism are the same. They are not. There was a distinction between the two, and the distinction is fundamentally an ideological distinction. Islamism is a politically purposeful ideology which seeks to replace existing orders with a new Islamized order. And this goes back to the origins of Islamism with Hassan al-Banna in the 1920s, and particularly to the systematization of Islamism by Abul Maududi, the Indo-Pakistani ideologue, and Sayyid Qutb in the Middle East, neither of whom actually were trained jurisprudents or theologians or hadith scholars, and actually took a very modernist view of the role of religion in forming the political community. And at the heart of this is this question of legitimacy. And I was reading something the other day, actually. It was from the Ion Institute, which talked about the important thing being not the nation state, but the ummah, the community of believers. The community of believers itself then constitutes the political community. This actually is not what happens in most of the modern Middle East or most of the modern Islamic world. There are nation states all over the place. And people will feel themselves to be, you see this particularly in Saudi Arabia at the moment, you see it in Jordan, you see it in Syria, you see it in Iraq, you see it. People identify with the state. They could also identify in some sense with the ummah. But this becomes a sort of binary choice for Islamists. And this issue of the challenge that Islamist ideology poses to the liberal order is at the heart of this issue about values, about British values, what British values are, and what it is that's being contested. Associated with that is this question of violence. Now, you can contest any order you like, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, debate is by and large free. Although I think it is also true that liberalism can't vote to abolish itself, in which case it ceases to be liberalism. At that point, this is a Wittgensteinian point, for those of you familiar with Wittgenstein's views on the nature of games. But this nature, it is essentially contestatory, and it essentially denies the legitimacy of the liberal democratic order. Now, this is pursued discursively. It's also pursued in some cases by violence. Some Islamist groups, the Islamic State is an obvious one. Al-Qaeda is another privilege the pursuit of violence, and you see it in their doctrines of jihad, the jihad against the near enemy or the far enemy, and so forth. And the people who suffer from this, by a vast majority, are other Muslims. They're the people who get killed, who get persecuted, who get disappeared, and so forth. And this, if you look at what Hassan al-Banna, people say that Hassan al-Banna, when I was doing the Muslim Brotherhood review, I interviewed personally something like 50 to 70 members of Islamist groups directly in person. And I'd always ask them about this, and a lot of them would say, particularly the Muslim Brotherhood-related Islamists, would say, Islam, we are peaceful. إحنا سنيين. If you look at what Hassan al-Banna, and they'll say Hassan al-Banna was peaceful, wanted to pursue change by peaceful means. Actually, Hassan al-Banna had no problem with physical force. He had no problem with the notion of an insurrection or a coup, as long as it was successful. And in that, actually, he was very modernist. He was very close to Antonio Gramsci, the great Italian communist thinker who was probably the most unsuccessful practical revolutionary of the 20th century, but one of the most impactful thinkers. And Sayyid Qutb talks about the role of the vanguard in overthrowing what he called the Jahili state in the Middle East, which is the state of ignorance, which a word he derives from the earliest days of Islam. And this is characteristic. So this use of violence is always there in the background somewhere. Where exactly people sit on this ideological spectrum, from people who just want to contest the underpinnings of the liberal state discursively, and those who want to do it by physical force, is an interesting question, and it's a question that is properly something that the Prevent needs to look at, and which William talks about in the review. I remember when I did the Muslim Brotherhood review, talking to Cameron and to others about what we do about ideology, and I said to him, you need to have people who understand, who are area experts, who have the linguistic expertise, who have the forensic expertise to pursue to pursue lines of inquiry, particularly where money comes from and how money is used, and have particular powers to lead investigations. None of this happened, and in the end, we went back to talking about British values. I think that was a failure at the heart of government, actually, to talk about to deal with the ideological threat that Islamism poses seriously. As I said, not all ideological threats are violent threats, but they contain, by and large, the potential for violence at some point in their practice, and that's the sort of trajectory that the government, particularly those involved in Prevent, need to be able to pursue. I'm also very happy to see that in the Prevent review that William talks about the need for government to be far more proactive in rebutting the false, misleading, and sometimes malicious claims that are made about Prevent, and indeed the government's own attitude towards Islam, Islamophobia, and all those sort of things which are used to tar practitioners and politicians. Because I think William says this in the review. It does create an atmosphere in which people can feel reluctant, sometimes intimidated, in pursuing these lines of inquiry. And I think that is a very bad thing. And I think, as Lord Carlile was saying, if you look at polling in the Muslim community in this country, most Muslims agree entirely that the role, the responsibility of the government to protect citizens from violence and from radicalisation, in a more general sense, is something that they tend to agree with. But you will find, and I'll finish on this note. I was reading something else this morning. Islamists will often say, and I think Roshan Saleh was saying this morning in Middle East Eye, that what the Berriew seeks to do is to define what a Muslim is. Actually, it doesn't. The people who try to define what a Muslim is are Islamists, because they claim they have the key, that their version of Islam is the only true one. Well, we know this is not true because millions and millions of Muslims are not Islamists. Islamism is a subset of the community who seek to close down debate and intimidate others who want to open it up. And I'm very glad that William has brought all these things out into the open. Please.
Thank you so much. Dame Sara Khan, former lead commissioner for the Counter-Extremism Commission. Welcome back.
Thank you.
On platform.
Thank you, Dean. So in the 5 minutes or so that I have, I wanted to specifically look at and talk about the issue of counter-extremism, because William, when he's carried out his review, he rightly identifies that there's been a weakness in tackling non-violent extremism, which I guess is what John is also alluding to, that there's been a weakness in tackling extremist ideology and those extremist groups that sit below the terrorism threshold. And of course he references Alex's review as well, when Alex made the point back in 2011 that not enough had been done to tackle extremist ideology. And when I was at the Commission, those were certainly my observations as well. And so as much as it pains me to say this, the reality is that in the last 15 years or so, we have systematically failed to tackle the non-violent extremist threat. And during my time at the Commission, all the evidence I saw was that in this last decade in particular, the threat of extremism has worsened. So there's a real challenge there that I think we need to grapple with. Now, I completely agree with John, with William, and I think probably everybody on this panel, that we need to tackle the non-violent extremist threat. But where I disagree with William is the fact that he feels Prevent is the right mechanism to do that. I think that's actually a fundamental mistake, and I'll tell you why. Firstly, because if it's not managed to do it in the last 15 years or so, what confidence do I have that Prevent is now suddenly going to be able to do it? I don't think it can. I don't think anything has substantially changed that Prevent as the mechanism will be able to do it. I think another key challenge is that, in my view, the Prevent objectives are just too broad. You know, on the one hand, it's trying to de-radicalise actual terrorists, which, as anybody will know, is a very, very complicated piece of work. One of its other objectives is to try to prevent people from carrying out terrorist acts. And we know that in the last couple of years, almost half of the terrorist acts that have taken place in this country, half of them, had been referred to Prevent. So the inability to actually stop those people has been a failure from the Prevent side. Yet at the same time, Objective 1 of Prevent is about tackling the causes of radicalisation. Now that's a huge spectrum that Prevent has to deal with, and it hasn't done all of them in a particularly in a great way. And I think another key point really is that I think Prevent is always going to struggle with dealing with extremist groups that sit below the terrorism threshold. And we have seen this for years, because what these extremist groups are doing are not calling for violence or terrorism. We know that Tony Blair, David Cameron, they all, for example, wanted to prescribe Hizb ut-Tahrir, but they couldn't do it because as government lawyers were scratching their heads, their argument was they are not engaged in violence. And we saw this with Anjem Choudary. We saw him for years. He was radicalising people into Islamist extremism. He was linked to terrorist atrocities, but he himself had never crossed over into the terrorism threshold, apart from in 2015 when he professed support for ISIS. But prior to that, all of those years worth of him radicalising people into extremism was something that the authorities could not deal with because we did not have the legal means to stop him. And of course, there are other examples like Shakil Beg, when Justice Haddon Cave highlighted that he was an extremist. This was somebody who was actually promoting Islamist extremism, but he was not engaged in terrorism. So this reality of extremist groups who are not advocating for terrorism or terrorism, but are clearly having a detrimental impact on our society. And of course, there are many parallels on the far right side. You know, there are neo-Nazi groups in this country like Combat 18, British National Socialist Movement, who share the same ideology, white supremacist ideology, same grievances, same conspiracy theories as the prescribed neo-Nazi group National Action, but those groups are currently lawful in our country. Take the example of Patriotic Alternative. And this is a very good example. I mean, this was an organisation that was founded in 2019. It's now got 15,000 supporters. Every month, hundreds of people are joining PA. How has Prevent reduced the threat of Patriotic Alternative? What in reality can Prevent do when, if you look at PA's website, they make it very clear, like HT, that they do not support violence or terrorism? So I think the mistake the government has been trying to make over the years is they're always seeking to fix the non-violent extremism, or what I call hateful extremism. They've tried to fix this through the lens of terrorism and not recognising that what we're talking about is a distinct type of extremist activity in its own right, and it needs a different way of dealing with it. So John is absolutely right that actually what these groups are doing is that they are a threat to our liberal democratic order. That was certainly my finding. One of the reports that I did was Operating with Impunity, which was a review of the law, looking into the gaps around hateful extremist activity, where again those extremist groups don't cross over to the threshold of terrorism. And I co-authored that with Sir Mark Rowley, who obviously now is the Met Commissioner. And one of the things that was very apparent to us was these groups might not be engaged in terrorism, but are they creating a climate that's conducive to it? Yes. Are they undermining social cohesion? Yes. Are they engaged in acts of entryism and subversion? Yes. And ultimately, one of the things that they are doing, which I showed across all of the groups, whether it was far-right Islamist or any other extremist groups, was that these groups were ultimately seeking to undermine and erode the fundamental and democratic rights and freedoms of our society. And those fundamental freedoms and rights are articulated in Article 17 of Schedule 1 to the Human Rights Act, which encourages the state to protect those rights and encourages states to say that you have an obligation to protect your country from totalitarian extremist groups. Now, Prevent doesn't deal with any of that because it's not what I'm talking about, and what John has highlighted is not about terrorism. And so it's an understanding that when we're talking about extremist groups, it's that recognition of the wider harms that they are causing, and that it's about undermining those fundamental rights and freedoms. And you see HT, neo-Nazi groups, or a whole range of other Islamist groups that are doing that. And we have no mechanism, I'm afraid, to deal with that threat, that extremist threat, because it's outside of terrorism. So one of the things that Sir Mark and I suggested was that actually what we do need is we need a distinct infrastructure to deal with this problem. That is why I suggested we need a distinct counter-extremism strategy to target this particular problem. We need to relook at the laws around this, and we identified that there were gaps in legislation, so we need a distinct legal and operational infrastructure to deal with this problem, because I'm afraid that over the last 15 years we've just not been able to fix this problem through the lens of Prevent. And you cannot fix this problem through the lens of terrorism, counter-terrorism or Prevent, because we are not talking about a terrorism problem. And I think it's really important to understand that, you know, Prevent cannot fix all of our country's extremism problems. It just can't do that. We've seen over the last 15 years it hasn't been able to do so, and it's not going to be able to do so in the future. What we do need is a distinct counter-extremism strategy that focuses on this specifically. We need to make sure that having that alongside also, by the way, a social cohesion strategy. we cannot expect Prevent to also fix all the cohesion challenges that exist in our country as well. We need all of these things working in partnership together to create that whole society response, to have genuine pushback against not just terrorism, but for defending our values, defending our liberal democratic order as well. Very quick final 3 points before I end. Firstly, we need to move away from the language of non-violent extremism. I know William uses it in his report, but in all honesty, I don't know what it means. It's a vague and ambiguous term, and if we are going to use it, at the very least we have to be specific about the behaviours and activity that we are saying meets this definition of non-violent extremism. Obviously, I put forward a definition of hateful extremism, and the second point to that is I would argue any activity or behaviour that we are saying that needs to counter this has to be in line with our the freedoms of our liberal democracy, because we know that in the work of counter-extremism there have been many examples in the past where we have ended up capturing people who were not extremists, and that completely goes against the values of our own liberal democracy. Secondly, I would just say we need to build up the evidence base of what actually works to counter extremism. There's too thin an evidence base on the ground of what actually works. How do we stop people from supporting Cage's narratives, for example, and their grievances about the West and so forth? How do we stop people supporting Patriotic Alternative and joining their protests outside asylum hotels and so forth? How do we actually do this? And again, we're not talking enough about how we actually counter extremism, because that is where we are thin in terms of evidence on the ground. And finally, I would just say, look, we need courage, we need leadership, and we need bold innovation. The government needs to acknowledge where there are failures, where we're just not going to improve on things. For example, the idea that somehow Prevent can now fix this problem, I think is just not going to fix this problem at all. We need a completely new, bold and innovative approach of addressing this problem. Otherwise, I'm afraid we will find ourselves here in another 10 years having the same discussion about why is it that we've not tackled the non-violent extremist problem in our country.
Thank you. Khalid Mahmood, Labour MP, Birmingham,
thank you very much.
Pillar of non-sectarian politics in Birmingham.
Thank you very much. Apologies for being late. I've had to come back from my constituency, where over the weekend we've had shooting at a funeral where 3 people were injured. Gratefully, nobody's critical at the moment. But I've just literally had to sort of run down this morning, drive down, and managed to park outside, still in my car. So I think, so apologies for that and coming here. The issue of Prevent, I think we need to take a real grip of what we actually want to do. I think certainly what Sara was saying, and certainly what John was saying as I came in, is to look at where we've gone and where we need to go in order to deal with this. I've said for a long time, there's a huge iceberg. The bit that we see at the top, which is the radicalization, but the bit under the water is far bigger than what we see at the top. And this is where the preparation's being done. This is where people are being moved towards radicalization. This is where the non-violent extremism doesn't work. This is because what those people are doing, preparing those predominantly young people in our community, predominantly from the South Asian communities, Indian, Bengali, Pakistanis, as well as now African communities that have come in. So there's a real big issue of trying to deal with it. And I think the issues around Prevent, first of all, is that we've concentrated on too narrow a focus in terms of dealing with smaller organizations who always had a vested interest of carry on getting the funding for what they were doing.
You mean Prevent partner organizations?
Prevent partner organizations, and in Channel as well to a large degree, because we very rarely change some of those organizations. We've not had a refresh of who it is that we're working with and how we need to continue to work with them. So that, as a starting point for me, is a real big issue. And I think what's already been done in terms of the reports that have been put forward by Lord Carlile and by Sara, and I think now also by our very good friend, what's his name? William Shawcross. I keep forgetting William's name. William Shawcross. We need to, as Sara says, broaden this. We need to look specifically at different issues in dealing with this. We have people like MEND, who operate freely across all of our local authorities and across all of Parliament. They have unfettered access to Parliament. We have had people in terms of our parliamentarian colleagues, in terms of Islamophobia, APPG, the issues of how they raise that, how they deal with that. I've said for a long time in terms of Islamophobia, APPG, what it does is partly works for those sort of organizations who are acting as non-violent extremists, but preparing the grounds for them. When you victimize a young person by the words of Islamophobia, when you say that they are the issue when Boris Johnson said about the niqab and the letterbox comment, that the instances of Islamophobia raised by 700%, but give no real position around behind that, what is that worth to anybody? But what it's worth is those young people who feel more intimidated. That is the exercise that we're facing against. That is the pernicious actions of these organizations, because they know exactly where they're going. They know exactly what they want to do. And they know exactly the position that they want these young people to be in. The iceberg that is under the water is phenomenal. I see it in my community day in, day out. I see young Muslims moving away from their families and contradicting what their parents are saying to them. Prevent needs, first of all, if it can do anything, is I think the issue that it deals with in terms of in education is fine. I think that's an element that it should continue to look at. And I think that is something that can be progressive. We need to put some more resources in. In terms of dealing with the organisation, it's got to stop dealing with smaller. I said this to William, that we need to have mainstream organisation. We need to go to mainstream mosques in the community and tell them what's happening to their children, tell them what they can do, what information they can get. We have a huge amount of scholars who I'm sure will come forward and deal with that. And let's stop hiding the whole of issue of prevent. They are very resourceful. They have a very good network of Twitter trolls and everything else. As soon as you say something, you're totally deluged with issues that you fall completely behind and back on. So I think what we've got to do is to look at how we can pass that. We need to update our terrorism policy, which we haven't done for a long time. We need to look at the real issues of non-violent extremism, hateful extremism, as Sara said. And those are the real issues, because that's where we're losing the battle. We're losing it phenomenally with these young people. You see on TV these days, and this is where the narrative has been brought in, an advert or a community organization, they will represent a Muslim woman with a headscarf. They will represent a Muslim woman with a headscarf. So it intimidates other Muslim women who don't want to wear a headscarf. So the establishment essentially is getting in on this bandwagon. So that is where the problems are. We're not talking to the mainstream. We listen particularly to those people who are focused in that way, who want to deal in that way, and who want to continue to control, whether it's local authority, whether it's police, whether it's the health authorities, which is what MEND has access to, Muslim Council of Britain, the way it deals with these sort of things. And it picks up these occasional bits and pieces, that is, the amount of Islamophobia in the British newspapers. So they cut out single words, particular words, and they'll put that forward and say, look, this is what's happening. And that's where young people are trapped. And we've got to get more information out to them. We've got to get more information properly out to their parents and to them. Because this issue, we don't see it as much, thankfully, to the great work that our security services do. And we have to pay tribute to what they do, because they've done a fantastic job, both in terms of the Islamist radicals and also in terms of the right-wing radicals. They do a fantastic job evenly, and there can be absolutely no criticism of what they do. I know people try to criticize this, and particularly on the Islamist side. My colleagues in Parliament do this deliberately all the time, to present the wrong image of what's going on. So that's what we have to look at. We have to really seriously, on the back of the review, the Shawcross review, look at what we can do, how we're going to move forward, and how we need to deal with this on a far wider scale to be able to actually deal and deliver this. Because at the moment, I certainly believe, and certainly some of the people I've listened to believe, is that we're not making any headway at the moment. If we are to do that, if we'd say in 5 years, 10 years, come back and say we made a difference, then we really need to have a wholesale, really look at this and try and start again. So thank you very much.
Thank you. The Prevent Review launched on your watch as Home Secretary, or the latest one. Delighted that your first appearance pronouncing on these matters should be here at Policy Exchange since leaving office. Look forward, always welcome here. Look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Dean. And I think I should just start by not just thanking Policy Exchange, but actually to all our panellists for all the work that they have been doing way before I became Home Secretary, but also their continued work and support in this important area. And also thanks to William Shawcross for everything he did. And actually thanks to some members in the audience today that I worked with in the Home Office for making sure that we finally got the review published. I mean, this was 4 years in the making. Too long, my friends, far too long. But it was important. And I'll come on to some of the sort of semantics and why did it take so long and all that kind of stuff later on. But I personally think this review is a real watershed moment for Prevent, but also for countering extremism and the countries, not just the governments, but the potentially national effort into how do we address these wider issues. And I don't say that in a general sense at all. We can never take these issues lightly. And in the same way in which Alex said when in his opening remarks, sitting down with individuals that work on Prevent programs in the early days, I remember actually going to Sheffield to meet some incredible individuals from the community, from the Muslim community, who were trying to do what it says on the tin to prevent radicalisation and to do the right thing within their community. And what was so astonishing to me, which I think has come out in the Shawcross review very, very well, is some of the institutional barriers, the problems, and quite frankly, some of the wider societal issues that we now know need to be addressed, that Prevent simply cannot cope with, has failed to deal with, alongside the fact, and this is a real fact, my friends, our brilliant people in the security and intelligence services, every single week, and I've been there and I've seen this, are inundated with all sorts of cases coming their way because the definition is so wide and vast, but they still have to look at it, which is fair and fine. But at the same time, some of the referrals that come forward tend to be from the institutions of the state that look after the NHS or mental health, and this is where Prevent has now become conflated with basically becoming an arm or division of social services, and that is simply not right. It really isn't. Our CT police, our intelligence and security services must be there to do absolutely what they are there to do in the right way, and that is obviously to protect our country and to protect our citizens. But when I do remember, I'm afraid I remember too many cases that also came my way, but one terrible and devastating example, and this will live with many of us forever actually, the tragic murder of David Amis, my dear parliamentary colleague. The individual involved had been referred to Prevent, and I think Sara mentioned this as well. There are far too many cases of this nature. So I think, look, just a couple of points to make about the review. The review is absolutely fundamental. It's a watershed moment. It's literally put out on the table the good, the bad and the ugly, and we need that. It's one of those moments where we can actually see what is not working, predominantly what is not working. I think we should be clear about that. And we're not doing enough to focus on what does work, where the best practices, how do we capture some of the real change, moments of change basically, that can help with protection and de-radicalisation. There are some basic things for government to learn from this review, in I sense, which is, and it's been touched on already by the panel, things such as funding. Government spends too much time disproportionately, certainly in this area, but in other areas as I have seen, focusing on the vocal minority rather than actually dealing with the majority issues around Prevent and radicalisation and Islamism and terrorism. And that needs to be addressed. It absolutely needs to be addressed. And on the funding side of things, William's review was quite damning in terms of some of the minority interest groups that seem to get all the money. And there's no following the money and the outcomes for a start, which absolutely has to fundamentally change. But there's not enough scrutiny and transparency, and there isn't an even playing field. Well, quite frankly, that obviously needs to change. It really does. Then I think the review, I've touched on this already, the fact that the people at a community level that are working on Prevent, they are simply not supported. That has to change. They are good people. They are well-motivated individuals. They have fantastic links within their own communities, and we're thankful to them and incredibly grateful to them for putting themselves out there within their own communities to sometimes, unfortunately, you know, be the receivers of the most appalling incoming abuse, slanderous accusations against many of them as well, implications that can have a terrible impact upon their family as well as their own standing in the community. That has to stop, that has to change. We have to formalise processes around those individuals who are part of the Prevent programme in terms of how they function and deliver, whether that's training, whether that's more support. I think everything needs to be put on the table around the support for them, because the level of threats and intimidation that they have been receiving is simply unacceptable. It really is. And then, of course, some of the more wider issues around definitions. The panel's already touched on this. Definitions being too broad, too general. If we're to effect change in this space, we have to absolutely narrow down our definitions so that collectively the state, for want of a better term, understands exactly who it is or what it is they are addressing. Otherwise, this is just the never never. We're just sort of chasing, you know, white rabbits, going down rabbit warrens constantly, which absolutely will not deliver outcomes, and certainly won't lead to the wide implications around radicalisation, root causes, definitions of Islamism as well, and effectively how that term can be sloppily applied, misused and abused across society and across generations, I think, as Khalid has said so very clearly. And then I think there are some wider areas that, post the publication of this review now, there has to be a real stop and think moment across government. And this isn't just about sort of where does this sit within government. This isn't about reorganising the deck chairs, which, you know, every single government seems to fall into that trap. Sara's touched on this with her own work on countering extremism, and Sara and I had the privilege to work together along with Mark Rowley in this area too. To be an agent and a force for change, yes, we need to know what it is we're trying to do, but I spent far too much of my time as Home Secretary arguing around definitions and thresholds. Believe you me, I've tried to prescribe various groups and organisations that were doing terrible, terrible things. But of course, it never met the threshold. And then if you fast forward that and apply that to, you know, society on a day-to-day basis, you know, what pops up on the internet, what pops up basically on social media, where the police engagement and involvement is, it just becomes far too grubby and difficult to get any resolution or to affect change. And I know actually my colleagues in my former department would also bang their head up against a brick wall on this, far too often with me, express deep frustration. But we do need to change our laws in this area. It's been touched on already by two of our panellists. We are not moving ahead with the times anywhere near enough. The internet and digitalisation has created a new space for many of those voices and organisations, and now is the time to really, you know, affect some very, very solid change. So I just want to close my remarks there, but, you know, just by doing that, I do want to thank William for his work. I want to thank my former colleagues in the department as well, because this review was undertaken, took a long time, as we all know, but undertaken to actually be the catalyst for major reform and major change. This is not a case of just, you know, for the department to tick the boxes and say, we're going to just follow all the recommendations and findings and, you know, carry on business as usual. There is no BAU anymore, there really isn't. There have been a lot of harms, basically, even in my time as Home Secretary, some terrible, terrible terrorist incidences, Fishmongers Hall, David's murder, Forbury Gardens, you know, absolutely shocking. And, you know, unless you've sat in my chair and experienced that, you know, it's very difficult to even begin to express and communicate to the public what that actually means and looks like institutionally, as well as the professional and, quite frankly, the security response that we then have to put forward to protect our citizens and our country. So I want to be on the positive side of the spectrum and say that, you know, report is great, we need it 100%, you know, this is a moment for change, but actually we need fundamental institutional change, basically, within the heart of government, and not just within Whitehall. This is not just about Whitehall, my friends. This is also within the institutions of the states, the local governments, the NHS, you know, the whole lot, the whole shebang, basically, in terms of how they interact, how they actually understand what Prevent actually should be doing, and then actually creating a new delivery mechanism so that we can actually do so much more and be the change that we want to see in this area. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you. I'm sure plenty of questions. Can I just get some flavour, including some online, if you'd stick up your electronic hand there as well. Usual house rules, no question too outrageous. You just have to state your name and organisation first. Let me just see, there's gentleman there over on the far side. Somebody's got their hand up. I can't see who it is, but if you wait, if you can.
Hi, it's me, Dean.
Yeah, but I can't see. You have to state to others so that they understand your star quality.
I've got some experience in this area, but I want to talk about.
But say who you are. Just say so.
Yeah, I'm a former reviewer of extremism in prisons and the criminal justice system, which I led for the Secretary of State for Justice, Michael Gove, back in the day. But I also was a senior civil servant at the Home Office even longer ago. And I want to ask a specific question about accountability. Because one of William Shawcross's most devastating revelations, as far as I am concerned, is that senior civil servants were complicit in sending large sums of money to either extremist supporting or extremist adjacent groups in the community under the guise of community cohesion. Yeah. Now, I think this is it didn't take a review. Surely it should have taken conscience and intellect to know that that was wrong, and that lack of professional curiosity, let's call it at its best, I think is absolutely inexcusable. But how are we to trust that the institutions inside the Home Office and those same senior civil servants are fit to deliver this change? Because as far as I can see, there's going to be very little accountability for the catastrophic mistakes they made in supplying funding for groups that are antithetical to our values and to what Prevent stands for. Thanks.
Lord Carlile.
Okay, well, first of all, in 2011, I identified that problem when I did the review of the review. And I'm disappointed that nothing much had happened since then. I would acquit civil servants who are involved in this of complicity in the sort of criminal sense. I think it just became a very bad habit. My view is that the Home Office has the responsibility of forming the policy, because it's responsible for the policy politically to Parliament, and of providing the money. Thereafter, I think the administration of the policy should be done independently and reviewed independently, just as, for example, there is an independent inspectorate of the Crown Prosecution Service, an independent reviewer of terrorism legislation. And I think that sort of approach, making Prevent practitioners more collegiate intellectually, would mean that they would be much smarter as well, so that they would not be under the control of local government, and they would be able to surge in and surge out of non-priority areas where issues arise in those areas. So what I'm saying is I think that a systematic flexibility would obviate the problem that you've raised.
Sir John Jenkins.
It speaks to a wider issue, which is the issue of gatekeeping. And we've seen this for years, if not decades now. But certain groups, MCB is one, MAB is another, Men Cage at more local levels, seek to actually promote themselves as the gatekeepers to a community that they themselves define. And I think for a lot of for government in general, both at the national and local level, it's sometimes much easier to do that because you don't have to actually go out and find others, you don't have to constantly exercise the faculties of reason and judgment and due diligence, which you're supposed to, because it takes a lot of effort and a lot of time. And if you have these people coming to you and say, we are the people who control the access, those are the people by default that a lot of people do. It's lazy. I think it's fundamentally lazy. Some of this may be a question of resources, some of this may be simply a question of intellectual integrity and the power of thought. But it speaks, I mean, what Khalid was saying earlier about, about mosques and the rest of it. These people represent a small part of Muslims in this country, and yet these are the people whom we end up talking to, and in some cases funding. I mean, funding is absolutely disastrous. I think it just makes for an easier life for a lot of people, and that, it seems to me, needs to end. But this was Khalid's point about Birmingham, which is where I come from as well, actually.
Priti.
Thank you, Dean. So I've got quite strong views about money in government, which won't surprise anybody here whatsoever. Ian, you're absolutely right. No question about that whatsoever. But, there are some fundamental capability issues in government about money and accountability and all of that. Ian, you've been in government, you know exactly what I'm referring to. I personally, and John is right, there's an element of gatekeeping. There's a lack of accountability. And with that lack of accountability, I'm absolutely convinced, and as a colleague, Michael's in the audience right now, and he would hear me frequently say, you've got to have the skills and capability to know what you're actually commissioning and what are you buying, where's that money going to go, and what are the outcomes from it. And this bothers me hugely because, quite frankly, we've got too many government departments, and I think in the Home Office, certainly in my time there, I could definitely say I followed the money. I'm a money obsessive in that sense. But, you have other government departments that are constantly, getting cash out the door as soon as they can, announcing nice fancy programmes and wheezes. It is a cultural problem in government, it really is. So we have to go back to first principles and address all of that. But, we can't just sort of wring our hands and say it's all too difficult. We have to find alternative ways. And I think, actually, Alex has already said, independence, definitely. And this matters now because, we're moving, government and decision making and funding is moving much more to a devolved structure, much more localism and local accountability. So when we think about, prevent practitioners, for example, we need to dovetail the two together, put a golden thread throughout them. And of course, this to me actually speaks to the biggest challenge, which is the size of the state. The state is just command and control. It's all got to be done at the centre. We know best. You don't know what you're doing over there type thing. And we've got to break the mould and the culture of all of that. And we have to grow the skills and capability in government, whether it's about money, whether it's on terrorism. It's the overall approach. The entire skill set around this whole area needs to change.
Good. I see two questions online. One, Natasha Clark from The Sun. The other, Richard Score of Slater and Gordon Lawyers. Natasha, can you hear me? We can't hear you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Can you hear us?
Yes, all good. Hi, Natasha Clark from The Sun here. I just wanted to ask the panel what they thought about the independent review of terrorism, Jonathan Hall's comments about bringing Shamima Begum back home. Does he have a point that we need to take our threats back, or should we just sort of try and sort out a solution abroad? And while I've got the chance, could I also ask the panel about what they think about the tragic story today of Ernest Elliott, who was due to be deported, but was taken off the plane at the last minute and then went on to kill? Obviously, this is a slightly different type of threat. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. Khalid.
Well, first of all, in terms of sorry, what was the first bit?
Shamima Begum.
That's Shamima Begum. We at the Policy Exchange, both Tom Tugalat and I, have done quite a significant report on the legalising treason properly, going through the new legislation to produce that. And this would actually resolve the issues like this, where we have people who've gone out there who fought against our military personnel, and we just leave them there. And the part of the problem is that all the intelligence they have, we lose. If we and the other issue is that if we bring them back, we can't really prosecute them because we don't have sufficient information of what they've been doing out there to do that. But the treason bill would do that. And so therefore they've been covered by that in the first instance, and you bring them back here, and you actually then, obviously they're incarcerated, depending on the judgment that is given on that particular individual. But it allows the intelligence services and everybody else to get into that and to deal with that. So that really, I think, is the only and the best way to deal with some of this. But having ongoing, I mean, there'll be another appeal in terms of Shamima Begum that's going. So that will continue and continue. But that's just one individual. And imagine all the people that we've missed who've already come back and are in the country. So I think there's a real issue, again, of how...
And contrast all of the Western nations. I mean, the US has taken back its citizens. We know children. We are just ending up creating the next generation of jihadists. And so I don't think we can just wash our hands and just ignore that situation. We know that ISIS is making a return in the area, and it's just going to take one thing for those people to leave anyway. Whereas if we bring them back, I suppose we can have much greater control over the situation. But I think the reality is we are increasingly becoming an outlier compared to what all our other Western nations and allies are doing, and that's something we're going to have to deal with.
Lord Carlile in the apostolic succession before Jonathan
Hall. My view is that if the reality is that an individual is going to be stateless and left in a camp for the rest of their life, then the state with which they are reintroducing a label of law which has not been used for many, many decades.
Priti.
Thank you, Dean. First of all, I think on the topical subject of Shamima Begum, Sara has basically said, you know, it's very difficult. It is very difficult, and we are an outlier, but we are an outlier for a good reason. And those reasons include the threat to our own citizens and the threat to our country. And I sit here in front of all of you today, not just having read the files, but actually been involved in operational work around everything to do with, obviously, individuals such as herself and others that are not in our country, and the work that our agencies do 24/7 effectively to keep our country safe and to prevent individuals such as herself coming back. And we also, I've seen all the security and intelligence behind some of these decisions as well. So as much as it may be uncomfortable for some, as long as someone is a threat and an individual is a threat to our country and a threat to our citizens, I think it's right that they are not brought back here as well. I just believe that we have to do everything we can to protect our country. On top of that, though, I mean, look, the implications for bringing someone back here, what that would mean in terms of our courts, our laws, but also the type of resources that we'd have to put into an individual of that nature as well are absolutely phenomenal. So these decisions cannot be taken lightly. I think it's right. I think the court has taken the right course of action. If there's an appeal, then obviously that's a legal process, so we'll wait and see what happens there. But in the case of statelessness, we can't forget that she was also a dual citizen, dual national in that sense too, with access to obviously heritage elsewhere. I know that is a contentious point, but right now I think we do have to judge on all the security information around this particular case. I think Natasha's other question was in relation to the deportation, the individual of a convicted criminal, basically, who should have been on a deportation flight. Probably, I think it was back in 2020, Natasha. Is that the case you're referring to? I think it is. Yeah, okay. All right, well, just on that, I mean, I was heavily involved in that as Home Secretary at the time. And I'm afraid, as ever, we came up against, you know, various specialist immigration lawyers. I'm going to be very political, say Labour MPs, but also, quite frankly, a range of celebrities who, for some reason, thought that they should stop a deportation flight of foreign national offenders going back to Jamaica. And that was completely wrong. The individuals that were meant to go on that plane had a range of criminal activity amongst them, murderers, rapists, people who have done horrible things to children, and it was right that they should have been put on that flight. So I'm afraid it is absolutely appalling that that individual who should have been on the plane basically was taken off the flight and went on to commit a murder, and I think was recently sentenced for something like 25, 26 years in prison.
Thank you. Sir John.
My natural instinct is to think that she should be brought back and face trial here, because that's that seems to me to be the appropriately. That seems to be in line with what we consider to be the rule of law in this country. I think there are real problems with the evidential base for this, and I think if she was brought back and there wasn't a trial, or there was a trial which didn't succeed, I think it would be a scandal, a political scandal in some ways. So I understand that. So in some ways, this is about how we get evidence. And this, it's not just her. There's a whole range of other people out there. And some of this is about the way we can't use intelligence in courts, which is something I think that has been a problem for things like the Charity Commission, actually, for that matter, for a long, long time. And I also think that what's happening in northern Syria, the whole camp and so forth, is disastrous. I also note that the Germans, I think, have had two or three successful trials of people women actually, who've come back. I mean, the men tend to be killed, and the women come back. Two of them have been sentenced to substantial terms in jail. The issue of treason, I mean, I'm not going to argue with a distinguished professional lawyer about this. I think there is an issue to do with, in this sort of area of the treason activity and seditious activity. I mean, again, sedition, I don't think the Sedition Act has been used since 1906 or something. I mean, but it's interesting if you look at the way that in the Middle East, North Africa, how this is dealt with. The concept of fitna, which is a powerful concept in Islamic law, which is broadly speaking, it doesn't translate exactly, but broadly speaking, is sedition, is what Islamists are generally accused of in the Middle East. And I think we have thought that treason and sedition are things which belong to a previous age. These behaviours. Actually, we're seeing that they are there now, and we haven't actually thought through the implications of what this means for the organisation, for the political organisation of the state, and the way in which the state uses law to defend itself. I don't have an answer to this, but I think they are genuinely difficult areas.
Good. I know there'll be a few, but I'm just trying to get a flavour of who else wants to ask. I see there's a couple of yes. Richard Scorer, Slater and Gordon, lawyers and gentlemen there. If we take the questions as a clutch, just so as to maintain the, we can get as many
can
people
you hear
in
me
the
okay?
time available.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Richard. Sorry, well, just 1 second. Richard.
Yes, I'm one of the solicitors acting for victims of the Manchester Arena bombing. And I wanted to go back to the point about non-violent Islamist extremism and challenging it as we need to. And certainly part of the backdrop to what happened in Manchester. And my question is this. Sir John talked very eloquently about the difference between Islam and Islamism. But the reality is surely that the distinction between Islam and Islamism is actually very poorly understood by the general public. And it's very poorly understood, I think, by people at the front line of delivering prevent, people like police and teachers and so on. So how are we going to articulate that difference in simple terms for people who need to understand it? Because if you ask the average police officer in Manchester, certainly what that difference is, that they wouldn't even begin to be able to tell you.
Thank you. Gentleman there, sorry, name and organisation.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Owais Rajput. I'm a defence and security researcher, and also I'm ex-parliamentary candidate from Bradford East. Khalid, you're absolutely right. When ex-Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, when they named with the Ming to the local communities, is create fear and divide in the local communities, like Boris Johnson. Similarly, when ex-Prime Minister of United Kingdom, Tony Blair, drug in the war on the name of the just war, which was illegal war in Afghanistan and Iraq, also create divide and fear in the local communities. Also, ex-Prime Minister Theresa May, when she was the Home Secretary, she invited first time local communities in Contest 3 to consult how we can focus on and make changes in the prevent program. I was invited there as well. And late Charles Furr, he also passed away now. He was a DG Home Affairs, and he liked the work in the supervision of Theresa May. My question here to you guys: a lot of divide and fear in the local communities. After Contest 3, nobody make a positive change to to connect with the local communities. I can give you one example from Bradford.
Can you ask a question?
Yeah, the question.
Please.
Yeah, the question is the 3 girls from Bradford, they moved into war zone in Syria. Yeah, they're born and brought up in UK. Their heritage country was in Asia and Pakistan. They refused to go to Pakistan, but they also refused to stay in this country. But they fly with minor kids to the war zone. My question is here, they are 4th and 5th generation born and brought up in UK. Why and how we treat them that they decide to go a war zone?
Thank you. Panel. Sir John, do you want?
I mean, just very quickly on the last question, the issue of why people get radicalised is a very complex one. And quite often, the path to radicalisation is a very individual one. A lot of it is to do, some of it is to do with ideology, some of it is to do with networks. And we've seen this, we've had the Middle East and North Africa, and we see it in Europe. We know, for example, that somewhere like Ravenna in Italy has over the last 2 decades been one of the great hubs of recruitment for the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, and that's actually because of social networks and family networks within Ravenna. So a lot of it, you need to disentangle this in individual cases. The first question about the distinction between Islam and Islamism, it is you need. I mean, I said this when I was doing the Muslim Brotherhood review to David Cameron. You need. Some of this is about expertise. You need to be to study this. It's not actually, in the end, if you study it, that complex a distinction. One is a highly modernist, activist, political ideology of change, a revolutionary ideology of change. Even if you don't want to overthrow states by force, you want to actually change their nature by a conceptual and discursive revolution. And the other is a faith system, a civilization, a 1,400-year tradition of jurisprudence, very complex tradition of jurisprudence, all these things. There is a distinction. It's simply a question of how much effort you put into understanding it. But this question of expertise within government, which is, I think, what Priti was also talking about, is actually central. I don't think, we certainly didn't in 2014, when I did Muslim Brotherhood, have enough expertise at all in these areas in government. And officials moved on every 2 or 3 years, and then went to do something completely different. Went to look after the drains in Bath or something. And it was, I mean, I'm not sure they went to, it was, and that seems to me to be mismanagement. I mean, you talked about the mismanagement of money, which I also spoke to Cameron about, but there's also mismanagement of expertise within government. And I think this is something I think that the...
Then Sara.
I mean, just on the issue of distinguishing between Islam and Islamism, that is, I mean, it's such a crucial point. I mean, it's something that I've seen happen for years. And if you're a teacher in a primary or secondary school and you're seeing, I don't know, a Muslim boy become more religious, more observant, perhaps growing a beard, perhaps praying, how many cases or how many times have there been where that teacher then decided to refer that individual to prevent, because that increased religiosity is perceived as being a sign of extremism? And I dread to think how many cases of incorrect referrals have been made for situations like that. And that predominantly is because of the fact that people don't know the difference between Islam and Islamism. So how do we improve that kind of training? Should it be part of the Prevent RAP packages, for example? Should it be part of a broader training thing that we give with teachers? But I don't think it should just be confined to Prevent. I think there needs to be a broader understanding in our society about the difference between the two, because obviously that's the way the far right exploit this issue as well, suggesting that all Muslims are terrorists, all Muslims are supportive of Islamist extremism. So I think mainstreaming this is really critical, but the sense that I get is it always feels like talking about Islamism and Islamist extremism is just too difficult. It's what Louise Cater would classically say just falls in the too difficult box. We don't feel comfortable as a nation talking about it because we somehow think we're going to offend Muslims if we talk about it. And I think we've got to move beyond that, because you're not offending the vast majority of Muslims. A lot of the polling that we've seen, I mean, Crest Advisory did a great piece of research looking at how many Muslims feel, about Islamist extremism, and 63%, I think it was, of Muslims felt very concerned about Islamist extremism. So I think we've got to get over our own insecurity and lack of confidence that we feel we can't talk about Islamist extremism. We can, and it's really critical that we do. On the issue about the 3 sisters who left from Bradford, I remember that case very, very well, and it was really, really shocking. And I think this goes back to a point that I raised earlier, which is, where is our cohesion and integration strategy in this country? Why is it that women and people who are born in this country, perhaps 2nd, 3rd, 4th, or even 5th generation, why do they feel they don't belong? Why do they feel they're not British? And even if they've come from, you know, like Pakistan, why is it that they'd rather go and live in Syria? And I think, you know, John's right in terms of talking about radicalisation and about extremist narratives and this, you know, the Islamist ideal of wanting to live in a caliphate, for example. Who on the front line is combating that idea and promoting the idea of why it's wonderful to live in a liberal democratic society like Britain and all the freedoms you have. And one of the things that really struck me in 2015 was when we were seeing hundreds of British Muslims make that journey across to Syria. We were seeing thousands of Syrians fleeing in the opposite direction because they wanted to live in a country that respected those freedoms. They wanted to live in a democratic society. So there's something quite wrong in our nation when we're not talking about these issues around integration, belonging, the values. I mean, we've talked about British values, but really inculcating a sense of love and belonging. And that is partly down to the fact that, again, Prevent can't fix that. We need a separate kind of cohesion integration approach that really tackles this problem once and for all.
Khalid.
I think Dame Louise Casey's report into Bolton hit the nail on the head. It's a two-way street. The Muslim community's got to move across and integrate into the wider community. I came to this country at the age of 10. I was lucky that I didn't go to a grammar school, but I ended up playing rugby with a grammar school and had a great time, and then carried on doing what I did in the middle of Birmingham. I went to a comprehensive school, but I made an effort to integrate. That's the key thing. And I think for somebody to want to go out either to Syria or to anywhere else, not go back to Pakistan, I think this is the real point, is where these people, the so-called non-radicalizers or the non-extremists, are getting in and actually getting to people's minds and telling them that they're not safe in the United Kingdom. That is what we've got to tackle, and that's what those people that are currently doing this, whether they're in Parliament, with the police, in local government, in the National Health Service. There are organisations currently in the National Health Service, Muslim organisations, who are listening to some of the people that I've spoken to in the National Health Service, the way that they are grooming people towards extremism is unbelievable. Some of the things that they tell these people and what they do, yet we can't get anybody to take action against those sort of issues. So I think the real issue here is not what Blair did wrong and what happened. And I think when there are actions, there are consequences. But we can't be seen as the mainstream of the Muslim community to defending those people who believe that the only way that they can do this is through radicalization and through terrorism. We've got to stand up against that, and that's what we need to do. If we don't do that, then I think, certainly me as a member of Parliament, there's no need for me to be here. We've got to stand up for our religion, our community. Our religion is much greater than those who want to do it through the gun or the bomb or maiming people. That is against our religion. That is not our religion. And so we've got to move forward properly.
Lord Carlile.
Richard, the context of Richard Scorer's question, the Manchester Arena inquiry, is very important. The Manchester Arena inquiry is being chaired with extreme skill by Sir John Saunders, who combines the cerebral and practical skills which are needed to produce what should be a very important outcome. And I hope that he will, in his final report, address the issues raised by Richard Scorer. One part of those issues, which I think has to be addressed, in Manchester in particular and in other similar places too, is channel panel practice. My observation, having reviewed a lot of channel panels and attended the Manchester channel panel, was that the practice is rather unusual. There are far too many members of channel panels, and most of those who are members should be providing evidence, not taking part in the decision-making process. If I can give you a small example, to me as a lawyer, the idea that there are, say, 15 people on a panel who reach a decision, all having seen different evidence, is just legally untenable. Whereas if 12 of those people provide evidence and 3 see the panel, see all the same evidence, then you have a decision which is sustainable and resistant, for example, to judicial review. But that's down to Sir John Saunders in the end, and I think he'll do a very good job. In relation to the other matters, I agree certainly in the broadest terms with Dame Sara. I fear, I'll say this because Priti is sitting next to me, but generally anyway, the Home Office and Home Secretaries can't win in this area. And, you know, that's fair enough because you're politicians. You choose to be members of the Cabinet. It's entirely voluntary. You take the rough with the smooth, and there's a lot of rough. But I do think that the Home Office can't win sometimes because the structure of Prevent has not yet been sorted out. And that is the most urgent and paramount consideration in dealing with the Shawcross review.
Priti.
Thank you so much. And actually, Alex, thank you for your comments about Sir John Saunders as well, because I had to set up the inquiry for the Manchester Arena bombing, and it's devastating, and there'll be some amazing learnings that will follow from the final report. There's no doubt about that. And again, it's a case of how do we build upon those learnings and actually not just sort of tick the box on recommendations, but look at some of the system changes that will be required and perhaps integration, how people work together, the whole lot, because part one was pretty sobering and very shocking as well. If I may, I'd just quite like to build on a point that Khalid has made, and this is a wider observation and Sara's made it as well. I do think we have wider problems around integration. This isn't a Home Office issue. This isn't sort of, you know, a general issue for Prevent. I'm quite alarmed, if I may say so, by parts of the country where integration has just become a dirty word. It is deeply, deeply concerning. There are parts of our country where, quite frankly, they've become inward-looking. And yes, certain communities live in those communities. That's not an issue. That should never be a problem. But it's the ability for everyone in those communities. There are certain parts of the country, whether it's Bradford, whether it's Leicester, you know, where everyone works together and lives together and respects each other in terms of culture, faith, religion, and if I may say so, education as well. I'm very, very concerned about certain, you know, aspects of not even culture but religion, values sort of dominating even within schools as well. I've heard this actually from one part of the country just recently, and that's not on, it really isn't. I actually think this is becoming a very precarious situation. We saw some protests actually in Leicester not that long ago, which spoke to community tensions and divisions. Quite frankly, you know, it's not just now a second, third generation issue, it's now fourth and fifth generation, and there needs to be some constructive work, no taking sides, by the way, at a local government level. We need to be working together to ensure that, you know, when you're born and brought up in this country, you absolutely live and breathe our values. I mean, we are privileged. I say this, my parents, everyone knows my parents came here from East Africa. What a great honour and a privilege to grow up and live my life in this country and, you know, obviously to have the opportunities that I've had, but also for others as well, not just in my family, but across other cultures and communities. We need to be gripping that very, very sharply, I think, and as soon as possible.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking our panel today.